Chapter 4. Mean Old Mr. Krupp. Do you see that old guy looking out the window up there? That's Mr. Krupp, the principal. Now, Mr. Krupp was the meanest, sourest old principal in the whole history of Jerome Horwitz Elementary School. He hated laughter and singing. He hated the sound of children playing at recess. In fact, he hated children altogether. And guess which two children Mr. Krupp hated most of all? If you guessed George and Harold, you're right. Mr. Krupp hated George and Harold. He hated their pranks and their wisecracks. He hated their silly attitudes and their constant giggling. And he especially hated those awful Captain Underpants comic books. I'm going to get those boys one day, Mr. Krupp vowed. One day, very, very soon. Chapter 5. One day, very, very soon. Remember when I said that George and Harold's silly streak got them into big, big trouble once? Well, this is the story of how that happened, and how some huge pranks and a little blackmail turned their principal into the coolest superhero of all time. It was the day of the big football game between the Horwitz knuckleheads and the Steubenville stinkbugs. The bleachers were filled with fans. Jerome Horwitz Elementary see our big football game today. The cheerleaders ran onto the fields and shook their pom-poms over their heads. A fine black dust drifted out of their pom-poms and settled all around them. "Give me a K!" shouted the cheerleaders. "K!" repeated the fans. "Give me an N!" shouted the cheerleaders. "N!" repeated the fans. "Give me an achoo!" sneezed the cheerleaders. Achoo! repeated the fans. The cheerleaders sneezed and sneezed and sneezed some more. They couldn't stop sneezing. "Hey!" shouted a fan in the bleachers. "Somebody sprinkled black pepper into the cheerleaders' pom-poms." "I wonder who did that?" asked another fan. The cheerleaders stumbled off the field, sneezing and dripping with mucus, as the marching band members took their places. But when the band began to play, steady streams of bubbles began blowing out their instruments. Bubbles were everywhere. Up and down the field, the marching band slipped and slid, leaving behind a thick trail of wet, bubbly foam. "Hey!" shouted a fan in the bleachers. "Somebody poured bubble bath into the marching band's instruments." "I wonder who did that?" asked another fan. Soon the football teams took the field. The knuckleheads kicked the ball up. Up, up, up went the ball. Higher and higher and higher it went. The ball sailed into the clouds and kept right on going until nobody could see it anymore. "Hey!" shouted a fan in the bleachers. "Somebody filled the game ball with helium." "I wonder who did that?" asked another fan. But the missing ball didn't make any difference, because at that moment the knuckleheads were rolling around the field, scratching and itching like crazy. "Hey!" shouted the coach. "Somebody replaced our deep heating muscle rub lotion with Mr. Prankster's extra scratchy itching cream." "We wonder who did that?" shouted the fans in the bleachers. The whole afternoon went on much the same way, with people shouting everything from, "Hey, somebody put sea monkeys in the lemonade," to, "Hey, somebody glued all the bathroom doors shut." Before long, most of the fans in the bleachers had gotten up and left. The big game had been forfeited, and everyone in the entire school was miserable. Jerome Horwitz Elementary, boy, our feet smell bad. Everyone, that is, except for two giggling boys crouching in the shadows beneath the bleachers. "Those were our best pranks yet," laughed Harold. "Yup," chuckled George. "They'll be hard to top, that's for sure." "I just hope we don't get busted for this," said Harold. "Don't worry," said George. "We covered our tracks really well. There's no way we'll be busted." Chapter 6. Busted. The next day at school, an announcement came over the speakers. "George Beard and Harold Hutchins, please report to Principal Krupp's office at once. Bugs.
No, I'm just trying to get comfortable.
Oh no, there's bugs. Uh-oh, said Harold. I don't like the sound of that. Don't worry, said George. They can't prove anything. George and Harold entered Principal Krupp's office and sat down on the chairs in front of his desk. The two boys had been in his office together countless times before, but this time was different. Mr. Krupp was smiling. As long as George and Harold had known Mr. Krupp, they had never, ever seen him smile. Mr. Krupp knew something. I didn't see you boys at the big game yesterday, said Mr. Krupp. No, said George. We weren't feeling well. Yeah, Harold stammered nervously. We went home. Oh, that's too bad, said Principal Krupp. You boys missed a good game. George and Harold quickly glanced at each other, gulped, and tried hard not to look guilty. Lucky for you, I have a videotape of the whole thing, Mr. Krupp said. He turned on the television in the corner and pressed the play button on the VCR. A black and white image appeared on the TV screen. It was an overhead shot of George and Harold sprinkling pepper into the cheerleaders' pom-poms. Next came a shot of George and Harold pouring liquid bubble bath into the marching band's instruments. How do you like the pregame show? Asked Mr. Krupp with a devilish grin. George eyed the television screen in terror. He couldn't answer. Harold's eyes were glued to the floor. He couldn't look. The tape went on, revealing all of George and Harold's behind-the-scenes antics. By now, both boys were eyeing the floor, squirming nervously and dripping with sweat. Mr. Krupp turned off the TV. You know, he said, ever since you boys came to this school, it's been one prank after another. First, you put dissected frogs in the Jell-O salad at the parent-teacher banquet. Then you made it snow in the cafeteria. Then you rigged all the intercoms so they played Weird Al Yankovic songs full blast for 6 hours straight. For 4 long years, you two have been running amok in this school, and I've never been able to prove anything. Until now. Mr. Krupp held the videotape in his hand. I took the liberty of installing tiny video surveillance cameras all around the school. I knew I'd catch you two in the act one day. I just didn't know it would be so easy. Chapter 7. A Little Blackmail. Mr. Krupp sat back in his chair and chuckled to himself for a long, long time. Finally, George got up the courage to speak. Ooh, what are you going to do with that tape? He asked. I thought you'd never ask, laughed Principal Krupp. I've thought long and hard about what to do with this tape, Mr. Krupp said. At first, I thought I'd send copies to your parents. The boys swallowed hard and sank deeply into their chairs. Then I thought I might send a copy to the school board, Mr. Krupp continued. I could get you both expelled for this. The boys swallowed harder and sank deeper into their chairs. Finally, I came to a decision, Mr. Krupp concluded. I think the football team would be very curious to find out just who was responsible for yesterday's fiasco. I think I'll send a copy to them. George and Harold leaped out of their chairs and fell to their knees. No, cried George, you can't do that. They'll kill us. Yeah, begged Harold. They'll kill us every day for the rest of our lives. Mr. Krupp laughed and laughed. Please have mercy, the boys cried. We'll do anything. Anything? Asked Principal Krupp with delight. He reached into his desk, pulled out a list of demands, and tossed it at the boys. If you don't want to be dead as long as you live, you'll follow these rules exactly. George and Harold carefully looked over the list. This is blackmail, said George. Call it what you like, Principal Krupp snapped, but if you don't follow that list exactly, then this tape becomes the property of the Horwitz knuckleheads. Rules. 1. No more practical jokes or pranks. 2. No laughing or smiling. 3. No more. 4. No more Captain Underpants. 5. Wash my car every day. 6. Oh my goodness. Chapter 8, Crime and Punishment. At 6 o'clock the next morning, George and Harold dragged themselves out of bed, walked over to Mr. Krupp's house, and began washing his car. Then, while Harold scrubbed the tires, George roamed around the yard, pulling up all the weeds and crabgrass he could find. Afterward, they cleaned the gutters and washed all the windows on Mr. Krupp's house. At school, George and Harold sat up straight, listened carefully, and spoke only when spoken to. They didn't tell jokes, they didn't pull pranks, they didn't even smile. The teacher kept pinching herself. "I just know this is a dream," she said. At lunch, the two boys vacuumed Mr. Krupp's office, shined his shoes, and polished his desktop. At recess, they clipped his fingernails and ironed his tie. Ew. Each spare moment in the boys' daily schedule was spent catering to Mr. Krupp's every whim. After school, George and Harold mowed Mr. Krupp's lawn, tended his garden, and began painting the front of his house. At sunset, Mr. Krupp came outside and handed each boy a stack of books. "Gentlemen," he said, "I've asked your teachers to give you both extra homework. Now go home, study hard, and I'll see you back here at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. We've got a busy day ahead of us." "Thank you, sir," moaned the two boys. George and Harold walked home, dead tired. "Man, this was the worst day of my entire life," said George. "Don't worry," said Harold. "We only have to do this for 8 more years. Then we can move away to some far-off land where they'll never find us. Maybe Antarctica." "I've got a better idea," said George. He took a piece of paper out of his pocket and handed it to Harold. It was an old magazine ad for the 3D Hypno Ring. "How's this going to help us?" asked Harold. "All we got to do is hypnotize Mr. Krupp," said George. "We'll make him give us the video and forget this whole mess ever happened." "That's a great idea," said Harold. "And the best part is we only have to wait 4 to 6 weeks for delivery." Hey kids, it's the 3D Hypno Ring. Learn the art of hypnosis. Amaze your friends, control your enemies, rule the world. It's easy. It's fun. Only $2.99. Chapter 9, 4 to 6 weeks later. After 4 to 6 weeks of backbreaking slave rate labor, grueling homework assignments, and humiliating good behavior at school, a package arrived in George's mailbox from the Little Wise Guy Novelty Company. It was the 3D Hypno Ring. "Hallelujah!" cried George. "It's everything I ever hoped for." Let me see," said Harold. "Don't look directly at it," warned George. "You don't want to get hypnotized, do you?" "Do you really think it'll work?" asked Harold. "Do you really think we can amaze our friends, control our enemies, and take over the world, just like the ad says?" "It better work," said George, "or else we just wasted $4 whole bucks." Chapter 10, the 3D Hypno Ring. The next morning, George and Harold didn't arrive early at Mr. Krupp's house to wash his car and re-shingle his roof. In fact, they were even a little late getting to school. When they finally showed up, Mr. Krupp was standing at the front door waiting for them. And boy, was he mad. Mr. Krupp escorted the boys into his office and slammed the door. "All right, where were you two this morning?" he growled. "We wanted to come over to your house," said George, "but we were busy trying to figure out the secret of this ring." "What ring?" snapped Mr. Krupp. George held up his hand and showed the ring to Principal Krupp. "It's got one of those weird patterns on it," said Harold. "If you stare at it long enough, a picture appears." "Well, hold still," snarled Mr. Krupp. "I can't see the darn thing." "I have to move it back and forth," said George, "or else it won't work." Mr. Krupp's eyes followed the ring back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth. "You have to steer deeper into the ring," said Harold. "Deeper, deeper, deeper, deeper. You are getting sleepy," said George. "Very sleepy." Mr. Krupp's eyelids began to droop. "I'm so sleepy," he mumbled. After a few minutes, Mr. Krupp's eyes were closed tight, and he began to snore. "You are under our spell," said George. "When I snap my fingers, you will obey our every command." Snap! I will obey, mumbled Mr. Krupp. All right, said George. Have you still got that videotape of me and Harold? Yes, mumbled Mr. Krupp. Well, hand it over, bub, George instructed. Mr. Krupp unlocked a large file cabinet and opened the bottom drawer. He reached in and handed George the videotape. George stuffed it into his backpack. Harold took a different video out of his backpack and put it into the file cabinet. What's that video? Asked George. It's one of my little sister's old Boomer the Purple Dragon sing-along videos. Nice touch, said George. Chapter 11. Fun with Hypnosis. When Harold bent down close to close the file cabinet, he took a quick look inside. Whoa, he cried. Look at all the stuff in here. The file cabinet was filled with everything Mr. Krupp had taken away from the boys over the years. There were slingshots, whoopee cushions, skateboards, fake doggy doo-doo, you name it, it was in there. Look at this, cried George. A big stack of Captain Underpants comics. He's got every issue, said Harold. For hours, the two boys sat on the floor, laughing and reading their comics. Finally, George looked up at the clock. Yikes, he said. It's almost lunchtime. We better clean up this mess and get to class. The boys looked up at their principal, who'd been standing behind them in a trance all morning. Gee, I almost forgot about Mr. Krupp, said Harold. What should we do with him? You want to have some fun? Asked George. Why not, said Harold. I haven't had any fun in the last 4 to 6 weeks. Cool, said George. He walked up to Mr. Krupp and snapped his fingers. You are a chicken, he said. Suddenly, Mr. Krupp leaped onto his desk and flapped his arms. He cried, kicking his papers off the desk behind him and pecking at his pen and pencil set. George and Harold howled with laughter. Let me try, said Harold. You are a monkey. You gotta snap your fingers, said George. Oh yeah, said Harold. You are a monkey. Suddenly, Mr. Krupp sprang off his desk and began swinging from the fluorescent light fixtures. He shrieked, leaping from one side of the room to the other. George and Harold laughed so hard they almost cried. My turn, said George. Let's see. What should we turn him into next? I know, said Harold, holding up a Captain Underpants comic. Let's turn him into Captain Underpants. Good idea, said George. You are now the greatest superhero of all time, the amazing Captain Underpants. Mr. Krupp tore down the red curtain from his red office window and tied it around his neck. Then he took off his shoes, socks, shirts, pants, and his awful toupee. Tra-la-la, he sang. Mr. Krupp stood before them, looking quite triumphant, with his cape blowing in the breeze of the open window. George and Harold were dumbfounded. You know, said George, he kind of looks like Captain Underpants. Yeah, said Harold. After a short silence, the two boys looked at each other and burst into laughter. George and Harold had never laughed so hard in all their lives. Tears ran down their faces as they rolled about the floor, shrieking in hysterics. After a while, George pulled himself up from the floor for another look. Hey, cried George, where'd he go? Chapter 12 out the window will be tomorrow.